macroeconomic topics, concepts are quite difficult in themselves. The concept of an aggregate is quite a difficult thing for students to get their heads around, much less those who aren't purporting to be students. But the problem for us as macroeconomists is that these are constantly being paraded in the public. Suddenly, 20 or 30 years or 25 years ago, finance segment started on the news and squeezed the sport. And I'd much rather that didn't happen. And every day there's headlines. I've written letters to vice chancellors saying, why are you overseeing the reduction of economics when economics is every day in the headlines? You never read something about human resource management or marketing or something, business studies in the headlines. Economics is there every day. And so they're difficult per se, but they're not well understood at all. Social media exacerbates problems. So the blogosphere now has got all these so-called experts on economics who discuss quite complex topics every day, completely divorced from what the concepts are. And that feeds on itself. So you have these Facebook debates and it's just amazing. Overriding that difficulty in that the comprehension degree, you've got the ideological frame. And that frames that exploits the difficulty of the concepts and the lack of comprehension, and then abuses that for the ideological end. And of course the dominant ideology, which we now call neoliberal, even John's using that word, which is the one I noted. Economists, I still would say neoclassical economics, but neoliberal's the term. And the success of that is down, in our view, the argument we make here is it's down to the way it frames the argument and uses language, not its evidence base. And later I'll conclude that it's a degenerating paradigm in a sort of Lakatos sense. It fails to predict anything, any novel facts. It misses all the novel facts. But it's brilliant at framing, organisation of the frame and the languages it uses. And what I'm arguing is, as one of the sort of main proponents of what we now call modern monetary theory, which is some aspect ill-defined of post-Keynesian theory, is I believe we have a coherent narrative about economics. Over many years now we've been building this up together, the group that I work with, and I believe it's coherent, it's internally consistent, it has empirical robustness, but it fails to cut through. And that's what the paper's about. And we argue it's failed to gain traction because there's an incomplete understanding of key macroeconomic terms, so there's an education component here. And I've been thinking that was, as the educator, I've been adopting the view that it was just mere education. And of course, as I've had these discussions over a long time now with Louise, she's convinced me that it's much more than education of the economics, that it's about learning language and the way in which humans cognitive process work and assess facts and information. And what we know is that we accept propositions and support proponents of propositions, that is political parties, which undermine our own well-being, but we continue to support them. And that's all down to the frame and the use of these cultural metaphors. And what we show in the paper is how that happens, and what we start off, this is a long project now, of how we might move to a more effective way of framing the ideas. So it's no longer for me about what the facts are. The facts, I know the facts. That's the arrogance of the economist. I think MMT has got a pretty good view of operational reality. So now the next stage for my research and for part of Coffey's research, given I'm part of Coffey, is that this is about language and metaphor and cognition. So these are two visions of the economy. This is the sort of dominant vision, and I've just quickly listed a few things here. The way in which we educate students, and I'd say neoclassical economics trains students because it's not education. is this is sort of an individualistic, natural view of the world, the deity view of the economy. That the economy's up here and it's a natural entity. It occasionally gets sick if we interfere with it. Its natural processes. It's removed from us, and we and the planet are servants of the economy. And we should have faith and work hard and sacrifice and all these moral and biblical type terms are used all the time about hard work and sacrifice. Because if we don't do that, it'll get sick. And that's the objective is that, not this. Much more selfish type things. And once you've developed a coherent social purpose that you can get people to resonate with, then you can start articulating operational realities, but not before. Here's an example of purpose. Some of Coffee Gang will remember we've had dealings with the New Zealand Mayor's Task Force, which created a job guarantee in New Zealand in a conservative era. And this was a bunch of mayors who got sick of their kids not having any jobs in their local government areas. And they're very successful at framing a social purpose. So they had this thing, zero waste of New Zealanders. And we can all identify with that. That's not challengeable. Our youth, our future. So what's that? Yeah. And the other thing that the literature informs us is that these broad goals cannot be motherhood statements. They must be associated with what are called concrete actions. So, and this is invoking these event causation structures. They've got to be, and these got to be linked to metaphors that we use to understand things. So, for example, jobs for all. A progressive might say that, and I would have said it. And that's desirable and everybody would agree for that. And then of course the Conservative will say, well, free markets will grow the economy and create jobs. And that comes straight off the American Republican election campaign, last presidential election, that statement. I got it from there. Well, that's not, there's no action there. There's no causation there. It's just resonating with the dominant metaphors. So progressives always have to define the purpose and then relate that to appropriate actions. So we want jobs for all, but then we might say aggregate demand has to rise by X to generate Y, and then that's invoking these purpose and causation structures, which then lead to questions, well, who's responsible for that? Because when you say the free market will generate jobs, what does that mean? Who's responsible? Who's actually going to take the action, and how does that happen? Because we want a narrative where we want to build back into the debate and public acceptance that the government has to take action to do things. And so you've got this purpose, event, causation. We've got to build that into why that generates action, who's going to take the action. And the other thing that progressive narratives get lost in is the sort of value-based statements. And there's, institutes of common purpose to that. And these are all just motherhood statements that we all agree with. They're all wonderful. They make us feel warm. So the challenge is in two parts. I think we've still got to keep educating people about macro. But we also need to develop this language that appeals to intrinsic frames. And so last bit of the talk is just to give you some feel for where we've started to develop some thinking. So here's one of the primary metaphors, and this is the work of Lakoff and Johnson and their group. Here's a primary metaphor. Purposes are destinations. This is something that we relate to intrinsically. And we all want to achieve purposes. And we identify that we're succeeding when we've reached a particular destination that we relate to the purpose. This is just basic to the way, these are these basic metaphors that determine how we think and assess things. So we've got to define a destination. And so we've got to define that in terms of people rather than the economy. So we should never get into conversations about the size of the deficit. We should get into, or the public debt ratio. We should never even talk about those. We should talk about people, how the economy is going to advance, and the purpose is for the people, or the environment, or something that matters to us. Purposes are desired objects. The bulbs are all these primary metaphors. So it's pointless to get locked into debates about financial ratios. These just reinforce the frames of sacrifice and rectitude and the rest of it. We always should point to desired objects that relate directly to intrinsic frames. So we want progressives should always just be hammering what we want this economy to achieve. Okay, very quickly. Language really matters. Saying things like government spending. What the neuroscientists tell us is that we intrinsically relate spent to gone. We've spent it. We're spent. And then the government spent all this money, but it's just gone. Where's it gone? Nowhere. It's gone.
That's our money too.
Yeah, well, and so, you know, from now on, you won't hear me unless I trip up. You won't hear me use the word government spending. I'm going to always say from now on, government invested money. So this is the more is up metaphor, which is absolutely one of the most basic metaphors that drive our behaviour and thinking. And so invest means building up, whereas spend means using up. Government deficit is X% of GDP, statement. This is the more of up metaphor working in reverse, because for something we intrinsically think is bad, deficit's bad, then up is bad. And so the budget triggers, there's two things here. The more is up metaphor triggers the bad association, and the use of the word budget triggers the household metaphor straight away. And so I'm never going to, unless I trip up, I'm not going to ever use the word budget again. I'm serious. This is language. Language matters. So I'm going to start, I only talk about government balances or government deficits, but I won't use the word budget anymore.
Don't use that word.
And you can exploit the other thing that the cognitive linguists tell us and the neuroscientists is you can exploit the more is up metaphor by linking it through what they call event structure metaphors. And so more is up can be linked with purposes of destinations, and the destination must be prominent. So for example, I might say, instead of saying the government deficit rose, I would always now have to link it with some desired purpose or destination. Government deficit rose and generated higher levels of net wealth for households and firms, because that's a fact. A deficit injects net financial assets in the currency issued to the economy. That's a fact. But now I'm relating through the event causation type structure two things and exploiting the more is up, because this will become the dominant message. Wealth up, more, good. Okay, so a couple more things. There's these primary metaphors, causes are forces and causation is forced. So we intrinsically understand that causes work by something changing, forcing a change, and you need to have some force doing that. And so this is a beautiful way in which we can disabuse this natural event causation in the figure model number one, because we have to sell a message that the government action forces the movement that we desire, and that desire is forcing the achievement of our goals.
So
because
without that.
Yeah, well, I can't read where. And that there's no movement unless you have that force. Yeah, thank you. So in conclusion, this is an ongoing research program for us. We've just started it because the PhD's just finished. I met the senior official in European Parliament the other day, and I promised him a progressive language handbook by the end of next year, because they want to run workshops in Europe to try to build this type of thinking. And you know, the aim is quite clear. We want to undermine the ideological hold that the orthodoxy has on the mainstream economics, but we understand, or I understand now, that you don't do that by producing a better facts set. We've been doing that for years and years, and we haven't got anywhere. Or having better logical propositions, or continually saying to people, we understand operational reality better than you do. Well, so what? That doesn't mean anything to anybody other than us. We have a cup of tea and feel good, and nobody else cares. What we aim now, in my research program and work I'm doing with Louise O'Connors, is that we aim to achieve this task by getting smarter use of metaphors and languages, and increasingly sophisticated use of language, culling words out of our lexicon, things that I just would use intrinsically because of my background in education. I'm now in carefully assessing every word I use and write. So that's the paper. Thank you.